USN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
Kerry Lutz, Financial Survival Network. We are still on the road. We're fortunate enough to have Ivan Eland. You know him well. He's a senior fellow and director, Center on Peace and Liberty. His background's too extensive to even make a dent in right now, but he's been on the show many times before. Today we're talking about the fact that Russia has a national strategy that matched the times. You know about Putin being the former KGB agent and chess player, and, well, we don't even know what the U.S. is playing. Ivan, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Kerry.
Hey, so this strategy that the Russians are playing here, it's very understandable, isn't it? As far as the Ukraine goes, they're really pursuing their national interest, keeping those ports on the Black Sea, and really, you know, they're feeling kind of encircled by the expansion of NATO and threatened by the U.S.
Yeah, well, you know, we have to go back a little ways. Even after World War II, when the U.S. had, Japan, Italy, in the Western Europe, western part of Germany, which was the best part of Germany, we allowed the Russians an Eastern European sphere of influence. And the reason they did that, of course, conservatives later criticized that, but the reason FDR did that was because the Germans, out of all the 50 million people killed in World War II, the Russians, half of them were Russian, 25 million, which is astounding. Russia had by far the most people killed in World War II than any other country. In fact, Germany only had 5 million people, and they lost the war, and Russia was on the winning side, and they lost all those people. So in the Russian psyche, a sphere of influence is important. Well, if you want to get a leader like Putin, what you do is you keep expanding NATO, rubbing the enemy's nose in his defeat after this happened. And so what we're faced with now is like Putin is down to, a semi-unreliable ally in Belarus, and he was down to a semi-unreliable leader, Yanukovych, in Ukraine. And of course, Yanukovych was overthrown. And so now Putin is trying to salvage what he can from Ukraine. So, this idea, I don't support what Putin has done. I think it's a violation of sovereignty. But of course, the U.S. did that in Kosovo. The roles were flipped as the U.S. was trying to pull Kosovo into a status of an independent country or towards that direction. And of course, Russia was opposing it because it was coming out of Serbia, Russia's ally. So the positions have been flipped, but Putin is trying to salvage what he can out of Ukraine. He's doing this out of a position of weakness, and he's also responding to decades of NATO's expansion.
Yeah, you can't really blame him. And how could you see Russia giving up Crimea and those Black Sea ports, that they've had control over for 300 years? I mean, could the U.S. really believe that they were going to give them up?
Well, they had them. They were leasing that from the Ukraine, but I think they may have been actually scared that a new pro-Western government in Ukraine would eventually cancel the leases to their base in Crimea, and that Black Sea fleet is the only warm water port that the Russians have, so it's very key to them. And in general, it goes wider than Crimea. The Ukraine was always the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. There's a lot of common culture there and everything. So Ukraine is very important to the Russians, and we just think it's another country to incorporate into NATO or the EU. But, Ukraine is much bigger than all these other countries that we took over, like the Baltics or Poland or Hungary. the Ukraine really matters to Russia. And like I say, I don't support what Putin did, but there's a real lack of empathy for why this happened and any sort of introspection on the part of the West, because many of us were saying when they needlessly expanded NATO after the Cold War ended in defeat for the Soviet Union, that there was going to be a price to pay. We aren't always going to have a friendly drunk like Yeltsin doing everything we wanted. And of course, what we got was Putin, who's a nationalist. And the reason he's taken power, and he's, now I just saw an article in the paper today where xenophobia in Russia is running really high. And this is what you're getting, this nationalism, this xenophobia in Russia as a result of being humiliated. And, we saw after the Napoleonic Wars from 1815 to World War I, there was a unique peace in Europe. There were wars, but they weren't major. And the reason for that is that after Napoleon was defeated, they incorporated France into Europe, back into Europe. And of course, after World War I, they didn't do that with Germany. And of course, look what happened. We had World War II. And then after World War II, we did to some extent, but after the Cold War, we're back to our old tricks of excluding the adversary. And there was no reason why Russia couldn't be, under Yeltsin, couldn't be included in the EU and possibly even NATO if they wanted to make NATO a more of a talk shop, which is what it should have become if it stayed around at all. They probably should have gotten rid of it, but if not, then let Russia in and just make it sort of a club of nations where you can negotiate things rather than a military alliance. So we didn't do any of that. And in fact, we promised Gorbachev verbally before his rule ended in the Soviet Union. The first Bush promised him verbally that NATO would never expand. And of course, they have violated that promise on a few occasions since then. So NATO now is right up on Russia's border, and the U.S. has aircraft patrolling the border between Baltics and Russia.
Yeah, and what purpose does NATO really serve now? I mean, is the modern Russia a real military threat to the countries that border it and to Europe? That's what I want to know.
Well, I think,
how big a threat is it?
We kept expanding NATO because we figured the Russians would come back at some point, but then we have a self-fulfilling prophecy. Sure, the Russians are going to come back, but are they going to be friendly or hostile? And now we have a semi-hostile regime in Russia. And we could have had a much friendlier one if we would have just included Russia, made them part of the community of Europe, et cetera. So, this idea where it was kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, so to speak.
Yeah. So is it too late now? Can peace be made with Russia, or are we stuck with a new adversary, same as the old adversary, if you will?
Well, it's harder to do once you have these types of conflicts, because now, of course, everyone's forgotten our NATO expansion, and when it's all Russia's fault that this is happening. And Russia, and then Hillary Clinton compares Putin to Hitler. Well, we've compared Saddam Hussein, Milosevic, the Kim family of North Korea, Muammar Gaddafi. We all compared them to Hitler. When we start doing that, of course, then we go down the road of demonizing the people, and we really need to look at our own activities to see that we've done some of the same things that Putin has done over time: destabilize countries, actively invade countries. Remember Grenada, remember Cambodia, Dominican Republic in 1965, Lebanon in 1958. We've done this many times as well. So it's a little bit hypocritical to blame everything on Putin, although he certainly is a nationalist, and he certainly is a caricature because he never smiles, and he's an ex-KGB guy, and he's macho, and he's kind of a parody on himself. But certainly he's brought Russia back into the game, and in a way that we really don't want. We could have had a much more peaceful Russia, And I think because we demonized Russia or the Soviets during the Cold War, and the Russians ran the Soviet Union then, that we were still suspicious of after the Cold War. That's why we didn't let them into NATO. That's why we didn't let them into the EU, et cetera. And I think we're paying the price for that.
So how big a threat is Putin really, Ivan?
Well, his armed forces, there's been some cooing about his special forces have been better. And that's who's stirring up all this in the Ukraine and in Crimea, eastern Ukraine and Crimea. But, those are elite units. The Russian military is still not very good. And I also think that the U.S. and Russia will probably even make up to some extent after this, because there's one thing that's going to bring them together, and that's a rising China, because Russia and China have been sort of allied in the Security Council because they don't like violations of sovereignty. Now, of course, Putin turned around and did this, but they were usually teamed up against U.S. violations of country sovereignty, like Libya, Iraq, et cetera. But I think, excuse me, this could change because Russia and China have thousands of miles of border. They're two big, huge countries territorially, and they had a border war in 1969 when they were both communist countries. So Russia's a lot closer to China than the U.S. is, and I think Russia and the U.S. may be teaming up against still quasi-communist China in the future. And so the rising China may, in the end, bring Russia and the U.S. at least back to what it was before, and that was we cooperated on stuff like Afghanistan, fighting terrorism, strategic arms control, and then we differed on other things such as missile defense, et cetera.
That is a great point. We're going to talk more about it up next on the Financial Survival Network.
FSN Radio.
When your accountant wants tax-free income, this is what he does. Accountants know the law. They also know that any American could legally get paid up to 3 times per month, 100% tax-free. That's 36 tax-free checks each year. It doesn't matter what you make already. This simple strategy could work for anyone. Go to www.irsrevenge2.com to learn how. That's irsrevenge2.com.
The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
And we are back speaking with Ivan Eland. I'm Kerry Lutz on the Financial Survival Network. Ivan, you bring up a really great point that I've heard no one else raise other than myself, and that is long-term strategic interest. There's things going on, climatic trends in China that will force them to eventually look to Siberia, in my opinion, maybe not quite an overt act of colonization, but they're running out of water in China. All the major cities of China are contaminated, and Siberia looks pretty good. It's unspoiled wilderness, and there's an outflow of China towards Siberia. People, looking for greener pastures, if you will, and that's going to put pressure on that Chinese Russian alliance in the long run, and therefore, in the long run, Russia will wind up coming back to the West, right?
Well, I think it seems like it might be likely. I mean, we don't know. Maybe China will eventually break up, with the western parts of China going somewhere else. But still, even if China broke up, it would have a tremendous population. I think what you're saying is exactly correct, that this is going to put pressure on the Siberian area because the Chinese have so many people, and Siberia is empty. So there are very few Russians there, very few anybody there. And therefore, just that alone makes it a tempting target. There's also a lot of resources in Siberia as well, which countries tend to like. So yes, I think that is one major factor that could spur conflict between China and Russia. And, the U.S. has always been far away from conflict centers of the world. And that's why our founders had a more restrained foreign policy. They knew we had the luxury of that. And now with nuclear weapons and the cross-border aggression being less than it used to be because of probably the nuclear weapons, and also probably because of nationalism and the proliferation of weapons around the globe, assault rifles, etc. So I think it's even less likely that the U.S. would be invaded or even attacked by anyone. And therefore, we have the luxury of staying out of a lot of the stuff, even in modern times. And so the U.S., if it wanted to, could really, if Nixon were in the White House again, he would try to play one off against the other, which is exactly what he did when he was president. But you can say what you want about Richard Nixon, but he was really paid attention to the strategic realities. He really drove a wedge between the Chinese communists and the Russian or the Soviet communists, and a smart statesman that was president of the U.S. could just sit back and do that without any active interventions, and I think could really reap some handsome rewards for U.S. policy.
Yeah, I think we're getting to that point again, but probably not with the current occupant in the White House.
I don't think so. I mean, he's somewhat of a realist, but he's not. I don't think he's a grand strategic thinker.
I think that's putting it charitably. I don't know what kind of thinker he is, but certainly the people around him, which is really kind of how you judge, you really judge a president, I think, by the appointments he makes and by his advisors, the caliber of his advisors. And this person really, the quality of these appointments really makes you scratch your head and wonder what's going on there,
Well, I think that's true. But it's also Obama's himself. He draws a red line in Syria on these chemical weapons, and then, of course, surprise, surprise, he has to do something about it when they. I mean, that was like a mistake that a neophyte would make, I think. Yeah. And so, these are the types of things that you want to avoid.
Exactly. You don't want to back yourself into a corner and then have to retreat.
Right.
Yeah, it's just absurd.
And then that it does tend to embolden people to do things like Putin did in Crimea and may yet do again in southeastern Ukraine, because he feels that Obama is not. He makes promises he can't deliver. And I think that's why you really need to have a strategic thinker. We need to reduce what we consider our vital interests in the world, but then defend those very strongly. And I don't think they would take much defense because, we have the most potent nuclear arsenal on the planet, and we shouldn't really have that far-flung out vital interests to defend with them. But people would be certain that if you cross that line, that's, something's going to happen to you. I think they would respect that. But the problem is we're overextended, and we try to be responsible for every country. Why did Obama feel that he had to put that red line down in Syria? Anyway, Syria is not strategic to the U.S. It may be strategic to Israel, but I think Israel probably needs to worry about that, not us.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just been one blunder after another. And, Libya, it's a mess there now. You wonder what got accomplished with the bombing there. I mean, you can just catalog the failures one after the next.
It's very interesting because, of course, Bush and Obama both are responsible for the failures in Afghanistan and Iraq. Only Obama is responsible for the one that you just mentioned, Libya, which was crazy to go in there. But all three have ended up in the same state, and that is chaos and instability. And now that we've pulled out, we just wash our hands of the whole thing and walk away, right? Yet we have to. They say we have to stay in Afghanistan with this residual force, or the place is going to fall apart. And then they point to Iraq and Libya. Well, the logical conclusion was don't go into places like that. Instead of keeping your finger in the dike there, get out and let's do better next time.
Yeah, I guess you have to have some kind of goal when you go into these places.
Right. Well, that's another problem that we have. We tend to be nation builders. Like if we wanted to take out Al-Qaeda and maybe the top of the Taliban regime after 9/11, okay, but we went in there and we started nation building, and then when Obama came in, he increased Bush's nation building and escalated the conflict. And you're just going like, why do we need to do that? There are other countries where terrorists are more of a threat to us, or have become more of a threat to us, I should say. I think we made our own threats in these places like Yemen, Somalia, etc. Why is Afghanistan any worse than those? It's not really anymore. So why are we still in Afghanistan? We try to rebuild these nations, remodel them, if you will, and you can't do that with military power, really. Those are cultural factors, economic factors, and all these places that really mitigate against democracy.
Yeah, and then you wind up with a really disillusioned public like we have now that really just wants to pull everything back and never wants to hear about another Stan as long as they live, right?
Right. Well, and I think, if something did come up, it was legitimately threat to national security. I hope that's not true. Even in the narrower set of vital interests that in my view, we should take, then, of course, you can't get the public to support it because they're so war-weary and all these peripheral places that really didn't matter. And Vietnam had the same effect. After Vietnam, we go through this every time we have a fiasco. We went through it in Korea. Eisenhower was much more restrained after that. We went through it after Vietnam when Carter and Ford reduced their number of foreign interventions afterward. And now I think we're going to see another period, which that'll be great, I think. But the problem is you have to have a strategic foundation for what we're doing in the world, or what will happen again. After Ford and Carter, we got to Reagan, and he started ramping up the interventions again. And same with Kennedy and Johnson in the 60s after Eisenhower's restraint. So I think unless you have a strategic vision of what you want to do and a more limited one, you're going to see people forget after 20 years or 10 years and say, oh, well, hey, let's go do this or do that, forgetting, of course, how the last one turned out.
Yeah, and maybe that's the lesson. Don't forget and have a limited vision. And Ivan, just tell us where we find your writing and where we find out more about you.
Well, I contribute to, I do an antiwar.com column. I also do a Huffington Post blog. And then, of course, the bulk of my material is published through the Independent Institute, which is at www.independent.org. And my latest book is The Failure of Counterinsurgency, Why Hearts and Minds Are Seldom Won.
Yeah, great title on that book. And, of course, link to that site will be found in the show notes to this interview on financialsurvivalnetwork.com. And don't forget to sign up for the free newsletter on our site. Ivan, it's always a pleasure. We will talk with you again real soon, or till the next foreign policy debacle, whichever comes first.
Thanks, Kerry.
All right, thank you.
FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.